more than once, we can show them ads that we wouldn't get to show them otherwise. And the person in charge of technology says, that sounds terrible. I didn't, spend my life at this company trying to make search as good as possible just to do this. And then that guy just loses the argument, in my view, because Google at that point was too big to care. They'd been bribing Apple more than $20 billion a year for several years not to make a rival search engine. They had bought all the shelf space. So every browser you used, every OS, every carrier that you bought a cell phone from, you would be using Google. So why did they need to keep it good? And, as a coda to that, in the book, I mention another search engine that I'm always at pains to point out I have nothing to do with them, although I really like them and I mention them a lot as a good example. This company called Kagi.com, Kagi. And I started using Kagi while I was visiting my novel editor in Tucson. I was there for a conference and they put me up in their guest room. And my novel editor and his wife, Patrick, and Teresa Nielsen Hayden are the most sort of erudite autodidacts and researchers I've ever met. And we were, sitting in their living room having breakfast on our laptops. And Patrick said, have you used Kagi yet? And I said, well, no. And he said, well, it's like Google was when Google started. It has the relationship to Google that, say, Google had to Alta Vista. Like, it's just magic. So I used it for about 10 seconds and immediately bought a subscription. It's $10 a month. And I was merrily using it. And then Jason Kebler from 404 Media published an article about Kagi and said in the article that what Kagi is doing is mostly querying Google's search database. They buy bulk access to Google's search database. So these are Google search results, but reordered by a very small team of clearly talented engineers, right? But a small startup. Google, meanwhile, has hired a large plurality of the top computer science and mathematics graduates from every top research university in the world for 20 plus years. And the fact that using Google's technology, this however many people it is, half a dozen engineers at a startup, can produce significantly better results than Google itself can from its own technology, I think really tells you just how much of a choice Google's poor performance, its enshittification, really is.
So when you talk about the losing the argument, so that means like losing a really big argument. This person who is saying, why would I want to do that? Why would I want to, make it harder for people to search when just because we can sell ads? So it's like a loss of innocence, I guess, in a way, that people's idealism has just been shattered. That's what your book is about, right? And I guess this is an illustration of that.
Well, I guess, if you think of it either at the micro scale of like an individual wrestling with their own impulses or a firm wrestling with different factions within it, what I would say is that we have created the sort of enshitogenic environment in which the devil on your left shoulder beats the angel on your right shoulder every time, where the person who's arguing to make things worse wins the argument, because whereas before the person arguing to keep things good would have had the joint argument of it would be wrong to do it and it would lose us money to do it. And those two factors together carried the day. Now all they can say is it would be wrong. And I think that on an individual basis, there are plenty of people who are involved in product design or in managing firms who are making similar choices, just wrestling with their own conscience. But at the firm level, at the cultural level of a firm, I think this is very visible, that you have within the firm these factions that compete for different priorities, short and long-term profitability, profitability versus quality, profitability versus other ethical questions. One of the things that's changed with Google since 2019 is that they are no longer in a position where, when their workers object to producing drone technology to be used on civilians, the company stops. Now the company has gone all in for it. And so you have that those factional disputes being conquered by the worst people with the worst ideas. So I don't know that it's a loss of innocence so much as it is the collapse of constraint. When Howard Hughes operated under constraints, he made some really cool airplanes. When we took away Howard Hughes's constraints, He started wearing Kleenex boxes on his shoes rather. He grew his fingernails really long, and he started saving his urine in jars, right? And I think that, like, had Howard Hughes been in a position where other people could tell him no, he might have, skipped the pee in the jars, right? It's when you sort of outgrow any potential for someone criticizing you or pointing out when you're kidding yourself and others, that you to coin a phrase, you crawl up your own ass and die.
I like your images. I guess maybe though, like the angels never really had that much power. If the power they had at the time was only that it wouldn't be as profitable, that doesn't sound like an angel with much in their arsenal.
Well, look, I mean, imagine that you are a chemical company that can dump effluent into the community and kill 20% of the people there within 5 years, right? Uh, I'd say prior to this current government, I would have had a reasonable degree of confidence that that would have been an unprofitable course of business, right? And I'm sure there are people within these chemical firms who recoil at the thought of murdering people. But we know from history and from other places with lighter weight regulatory regimes, including parts of America like Cancer Alley in Louisiana, that those people don't win the arguments when profit is off the line. Like, look, I'm not a guy who thinks markets solve all of our problems. I am a card carrying member of the Democratic Socialists, but my friends who self-identify as capitalists are very excited about the thing that made Adam Smith so excited about capitalism, the idea that it is a kind of alchemy that turns the base metal of greed and self-regard into the precious metal of common good. And Smith wrote, right, it is not from the generosity of the baker that we expect our bread. It is from his self-regard. And markets, because of competition, because of regulation, because of competition for workers, markets are posed within capitalist theory as being an engine that transfers greed into public good, because you offer your workers higher wages because someone else will pay them more, and you offer your customers lower costs because someone else will charge less. And when you take away those constraints, all that you have left is greed. Right now, I think that, like, appealing to nothing but greed and having a sort of caveat emptor economy where what's good is whatever you can get away with is sort of tautology, where if you can do it, excuse me, if you can do it, then it must have been good because you did it. That breeds a kind of callousness and cruelty in people. But even within those circumstances, you look at people like Mark Zuckerberg, who very clearly from the beginning was not a great person, right? This is a guy who invented Facebook so he could non-consensually rate how fuckable his fellow Harvard undergraduates were. And if you read Careless People, the book by the Facebook whistleblower, is a very senior employee of Facebook. Sarah Wynne Williams, ran their international policy for a decade. You'll find that Mark Zuckerberg was terrible even in the years when Facebook was good, right? And so this terrible man produced a thing that produced so much value for so many people. And it's clear that given his druthers, he'd like to take all that value away. He would like to atomize you and just like cram shrimp Jesus into your eyeballs for 19 hours a day until your cerebrospinal fluid starts leaking out of your nostrils. But he didn't, right? He was corralled by social factors, right? Fear of his workers, fear of competitors, fear of regulators, concern about what other technologists might build to disenshittify the things that he enshittified. That stopped him. That stayed his hand. So you're right. I would love to have a society grounded in strong ethical concerns. I think those are very important. I don't think they're sufficient unto themselves, but I think they're very important. I think we disregard them at our peril. But I do think that we, even in the absence of those strong social concerns, as far as I know, Zuckerberg was born in the greed is good 1980s, right? So it's not like he grew up in an era of, I don't know, Calvinists or something, right? He was raised in a milieu that absolutely venerated greed. Even so, he was a better actor than he became later when we lifted his constraints.
So your critique is a larger one. It's saying that there was a time when there was profits and doing good kind of weren't that separate, or they sometimes went on the same track, and that's been
Mm-hmm.
debunked entirely.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a very dark world that you're describing. Actually, your lights just went dark too.
Oh,
Not,
sorry. Yeah, my screen flickered there. Sorry
I'm
about
not
that.
saying it's an inaccurate one, but it's speaking of imagery, you're really good at it. I mean, just like all the horrific images you just described, and also this thing that you're describing, the world of tech is often so anodyne, and you do a really nice job of making it physical and real. You have a image in your book where you talk about the cell phones hanging in trees. This is because of the
Mm-hmm.
Amazon Flex story. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Maybe just uninitiated who don't know what that is and why were these phones in trees?
Sure.
Mhm.
Well, Amazon, like a lot of firms, really likes to eat its cake and have it too. And so, one of the ways you can do that in respect of your workforce is by not hiring any of them, right? You treat them all as contractors, you misclassify them as contractors. And ideally, as subcontractors, you kind of want the people who do the work to be to be contractors for someone else who's contracting with you, which gives you a great deal of plausible deniability. If a driver runs someone over, if a someone is horribly injured in a warehouse, if they don't work for you, then you can really abstract yourself from any consequences. And yet, if you are powerful enough as a buyer, you can exert great pressure to determine the life circumstances and working conditions of those workers. So that we I think understand pretty intuitively the risks of monopoly, not just because we all played a very bad board game on rainy days, but we understand when there's only one seller, it can be really dangerous. But I think we don't have much of an intuitive grasp of the risk and power of monopsony, which is where you have a powerful buyer. So imagine you own a coffee shop, and there's a big office building next door, and 20% of your sales are to the people in that office building, and that office building shuts down, and you lose 20% of your sales overnight. That could be like a fatal injury to the firm. You'd probably have to lay people off. You might have to get a bridge loan to roll the financing on your capital. You might miss your rent. Like it's a really big deal to have that a 20% reduction overnight in your sales. But imagine you are a customer at that coffee shop and it has four other competitors on your way to work. So there's five coffee shops and one of them goes under. You might feel sad about the coffee shop, but you're fine, right? So the power that a buyer has over a seller is actually much easier to establish, much more durable, and constitutes a much greater risk than the power that a seller has over a buyer. So monopsony is very powerful. And Amazon likes to be a monopsony of labor. And it has a variety of different scams that it uses to deliver parcels. And one of them is Amazon Flex, sort of Uber for parcel delivery. You get people in their own cars delivering for Amazon. And Amazon, um, they take over the device that you use to connect to them. So they require all kinds of permissions from your phone to be a Flex driver. And among the things they can do is know where you are. And because phones are designed so that you cannot override their disclosures. So if you want your phone to say that you're somewhere else, your phone will refuse, not because it can't run that program, but because the manufacturers don't let you run that program. Flex drivers find that they are often shut out of warehouse pickups to do deliveries, and they are operating on a wage that is calculated to be the lowest possible wage to keep them, buying gas and paying their insurance. And so they're really operating on a razor's edge, and Amazon has really squeezed them as hard as they can. And so what some of these drivers have started doing is they buy a second phone, a burner phone, and they install remote control software on it so they can control it from another phone. And then they hang the burner phone in trees outside of Amazon warehouses. So as far as Amazon knows, they are outside of the warehouse, right? And so there's a lot of different things happening here. You have Amazon's market power as an employer. You have the refusal of the technology manufacturers to allow owners of devices to have the veto over how they operate. You have all of these different factors coming together to produce a world where we have this great act of ingenuity here, but really it's obviously very inefficient, right? Like, you can I don't know if you've ever tried to play like an old game in a browser emulator that emulates like an old version of Mac OS or DOS, right? You can run a program in your computer that tells another program in your computer a lie, right? I am a Macintosh in 1987 is a lie your browser will tell game software. And the game software can't tell the difference. And that is to your great advantage because it means you can play old games. Uh, that is something that we have greatly lost in other kinds of technology, thanks to this ethic that technology should be designed to serve its manufacturer at the expense of its owner.
What's also nice about your writing is it's always very pro-human. So these workers who put the phones on strings or whatever they do from trees, it's like they're winning, you know?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
obviously not really, but at least for us,
right.
sometimes
Well,
it's
there's another
a
group.
lot,
There's
right?
another group of workers I discuss in the book who are really winning in a much more thoroughgoing way, which are the Indonesian gig riders. So in Indonesia, the gig economy is very big, and it's almost entirely grounded in motorbikes. So it's not cars; it's motorbikes, including as taxis and whatnot. And so these motorbike riders, they used to work for a company. Now they work for an app and they are misclassified as contractors. They don't have a place they can go and rest. They don't have a toilet they can use. They don't have anywhere they can fix their bikes if they break down. So they're in a much worse shape than they used to be. But they started forming these little informal cooperatives where they would club together to rent out like a spot where they could just rest, have a cup of tea, use the facilities, work on their bike, do all the things that you need to do if you're riding a bike around the streets of, say, Jakarta all day. And through these clubhouses, they started to get together the money to hire programmers to modify the apps that their bosses use to send them out on jobs. These apps, they're called tuyul apps, Tuyul. It's an Indonesian word that means a little demon, a little spirit. And the first two apps were quite straightforward. They did things like enlarge the type on your screen. So a lot of these riders are older riders and they, like me, can't resolve small type on a screen. And so it would enlarge the type. It's just an example of how an employer cannot ever understand the best way to arrange the workplace in a way that the workers can. Right? Workers often know things about how to make their workplace more efficient. It's not to the employer's benefit to have riders pulling over to squint at their screens or getting into accidents because they're squinting at their screens without pulling over. Neither of those things benefits the employer. And then the Tuyul apps became much more ambitious. So, Amazon DSP drivers or Flex drivers are hanging phones from trees to spoof their location. Tuyul drivers just spoof their location. They just have location spoofing software on their phones. And, an Indonesian gig app will not dispatch a taxi rider to a train station to pick up commuters who've come in on a big commuter train unless that bike is right in front of the station. This is a very dangerous situation. The overcrowding is it's almost cinematic. It's just fantastic to see. And it's very dangerous. You don't want to be just circling in front of the train station because you can't stop. You got to keep moving. And so what the drivers do is they find a safe space around the corner where they can stop. And then they tell their phone to pretend that it's in front of the train station. And when a rider comes along, they just zip it and pick them up. So this is a way that we bargain with our technology. And it doesn't substitute for collective bargaining through a trade union, but trade unions that collectively bargain for the right to modify technology or trade unions that modify technology as a prelude to collective bargaining. So, for example, there's an app called that is no longer supported because the person who was maintaining it got a different job. But there's an app called Uber Cheats that lets Uber Eats drivers log their mileage and compare it to the mileage that Uber is paying them, right? And so you can imagine if you were unionizing or if you were negotiating a contract within your union, one of the things you'd want to be able to do is go in and say, look, we've got proof that you've been stealing our wages. The Uber Cheats app shows that you've underestimated our mileage by 15% over the last year, and that is X million dollars across our workforce. So one of the union umbrella organizations in the EU just released a big, really interesting report on how technology mastery can benefit labor, including organized labor.
So you see, you might have like a dark room at times, but it's actually really hopeful what you write about because you look for ways like even in these like small moments, workers are fighting back and it's very inspiring. It makes you like optimistic again. It makes you believe in the angels, you know?
Ah, well,
Um,
I'm not an optimist, but I am quite hopeful. I think the difference is that optimism is the idea that things are just going to get better no matter what we do. It's a kind of corollary to to pessimism, right? They're both a form of fatalism. I really believe in human agency, and I really believe that even though we can't always see a way to get from here to where we want to be, that if we take some material step to improve our conditions, that we will ascend a gradient towards a better world. And as we climb up that gradient, new terrain will be revealed to us that wasn't visible when we were lower down, and that we may see other ways of making our world better. And I think there are many opportunities for change right now, many reasons for hope. You know, one of the things that is quite ironic at this moment is that the rest of the world has terrible internet policy, not for the same reason the US does. The US has terrible internet policy because giant tech companies have taken over the policy world right here, and they've captured their regulators. Everywhere else, it's because the US trade representative has gone around and said if you want tariff free access to American markets, you can't be mean to our tech companies. You can't let people reverse engineer them. You can't have privacy requirements. You can't do all the things that might improve the lives of people in those countries, and also allow a domestic tech sector to be incubated by doing things like, for example, selling apps that change the way the apps in your phone work, or selling apps that change the way your printer works so it no longer rejects third-party ink, or selling apps that let mechanics fix any car without giving $10,000 per manufacturer per year to buy diagnostic tools that change your check engine light into a diagnosis, or they let farmers fix their own tractors. You know, the only reason other countries didn't design that, it's not because they don't have smart programmers. They sure as hell do. It's because it's illegal there because the U.S. trade representative threatened them with tariffs if they didn't do it. So the Trump tariffs are quite game changing, right? Because deterrents only work if you don't use them, right? How is we will apply tariffs to your country a deterrent when you're already applying tariffs? And so this opportunity is opened up all over the world, and you know, there's no way we'll stop that stuff from leaking into the US market, because any American with a payment method and an internet connection will be able to buy those tools from abroad, even if they remain illegal here. And there's just not going to be any practical way to stop this from happening. And so I think that there's a lot of space for hope right now. And also, when you think about all the smart technologists who have either been deported, or who have self-deported, or have had their visas canceled, or who have just decided not to try their hand here, and all the investors who said, well, US markets are now determined by who gives the biggest bribe to Trump, I'd like to invest somewhere more reliable. You really have a recipe for getting American programmers, formerly American programmers, American investors, formerly American investors, to build the technologies in other places that allow everyone, including Americans, to resist the enshittification of the technology we rely on.
so that's hopeful.
Yeah, it really is.
Also, I wanted to ask you, in your writing, you're really good with you could turn a phrase. It's quite
Mm-hmm.
nice. You know, again and again, I saw that. You know, even like an inkjet grift. Oh, it's just nice the way
Hmm. Thank you. Well, I write about this stuff a lot. I have a daily newsletter and I've written many books, and I work for the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I write for them and I give a lot of speeches. And, you try out a lot of different material, and when something works, you lean into it.
No, it's nice. You
Thank
talk
you.
about how, and also what's good is just kind of this steampunk sensibility, sort of echoing back to, previous labor movements, that were successful or not, which makes it very evocative. So you talk about how an app is like the modern, when the modern, it gives power to the modern black-hearted coal boss in terms of
Sure.
violation or their violations of labor laws. I'm wondering if you can tell me how you bring these things together and why that's important in your writing.
Well, I think it's important to ground things in historic context. There are aspects of our present day that are sui generis, that are unique, and that represent real changes in both what we can do and what can be done to us. But I think there is a temptation to blame the bad things happening in our lives on the iron laws of economics or great forces of history or um, the individual moral failings of various tech bosses. And I think that the problem with this is that it kind of lets the real villains off the hook because, we can trace the changes in our digital and economic environment to specific policy choices that were taken, in living memory by named individuals. We know what warnings they were given at the time. We know that they ignored those warnings. And if we say, oh, well, this is because Mark Zuckerberg is a monumentally unfit to run a company that's so important to so many people, and we ignore the fact that the reason that company got so big is because we let it buy significant competitors like WhatsApp and Instagram. And the reason for that is because one guy, a judge called Robert Bork, who is this like racist Nixonite criminal who had been Nixon's Solicitor General. And when everyone else refused to illegally fire Nixon's enemies in the DOJ, Robert Bork stepped in and did it. And who failed his attempt at becoming a Supreme Court judge because he handled his Senate confirmation so badly that today we say when something is really wrong, we say it's borked. That's from Robert Bork. And he said we should tolerate monopolies. He said monopolies were efficient, right? And we should allow predatory acquisitions because they were efficient, right? We know who created this policy environment. We know who their acolytes were. We know how the policies rippled out. So for example, a group of very wealthy financiers funded an ongoing education program for judges. So judges, like a lot of professionals, have to do continuing education every year. They have to do a certain amount of upkeep. Lawyers do this too, and doctors, teachers, and so on. And these wealthy donors created this thing called the MANN seminars, MANNE, which were free luxury junkets at a Florida resort where, in between golfing and swimming and getting massages, judges would learn the theories of Robert Bork and about how monopolies were good. 40% of the federal judiciary is a graduate of the Mann seminars. And there's a big, I can't remember if it's a Yale study or a Princeton study, that shows that after going through the Mann seminars, these judges' approach to monopoly law changed, and they became far more tolerant of monopoly. And then, for the 60% of the judges that didn't go through the Mann seminars, they are now confronted by this edifice of precedent that says that monopolies are good and efficient. And so it had this far reaching effect. And so, when you ground these things in historic context, and when you point out that, for example, this thing that Uber does, where they lower a driver's wage every time the driver accepts a lower wage for a ride. So every time the driver is offered a ride, they're offered a lower wage at first. If they sign on to that lower wage, then that becomes the new level, and then they're offered a lower wage again and again. That's something that coal bosses would have done in the 19th century, but you just didn't have enough guys in green eye shades with quill pens working on ledgers to adjust everyone's pay packet every week. And so it's just technically impossible. And so, we do ourselves a disservice when we ascribe to these people a special kind of ingenuity or a new kind of wickedness, when really what they are mediocrities on par with the mediocrities of history, who find themselves with more powerful tools.
You talk about your work like an investigative journalist, and in
Mm-hmm.
investigative journalism, people talk about it as, you know, an accountability. You start with the facts, and that's what you do.
Mm-hmm.
You map out these timelines the way you're describing, showing that these people weren't the first ones to do these types of things to their workers. They just have improved mechanisms for it. And then also
Mm-hmm.
building these murder boards, showing the connections between
Sure.
all these
Registering.
elements,
Yeah.
which is nice. Do you ever feel frustrated because accountability starts with presenting the facts, but do you see a lack of prosecution? And is that, a reality in your world? Is that frustrating, or is that you consider that to be part of, the way the world is?
Well, as I mentioned, I work for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a nonprofit digital rights group. It's been around for 35 years. I've worked for them. I'm going into my 24th year now with them, so the majority of my adult life. And EFF started as litigation shop. So we started as both like a defense fund for people who'd been unfairly targeted because of their digital activities. We defended the first people who'd had their emails seized without a warrant. Before the internet, this was just local email on a BBS, from a games company called Steve Jackson Games that had made a science fiction game called GURPS Cyberpunk that the Secret Service mistook for a manual for cybercrime. And they seized the bulletin board system and started reading the private emails of players of these tabletop role playing games. And we stepped in and won a federal case rather, and won the precedent that email is entitled to Fourth Amendment protection. So we started as a litigation shop. We were grounded in the idea that a strong rule of law plus private litigation could produce a kind of constitutional bulwark against the confiscation of human rights in the digital realm. And that's still a significant part and maybe even the major part of EFF's work. But, I was one of the early activists hired by EFF. I wasn't the first one, but I was maybe the third or fourth activist hired by EFF. And we've always had this outside game of trying to change policy more broadly, trying to change the way people think about things, trying to change about what people will tolerate from companies or governments or legislators or regulators or trade negotiators, to sort of change the political context for this stuff. And one of the discussions that we are having quite actively inside of EFF, as the rule of law weakens precipitously in America, is what role activism plays at EFF now. Is it time for activism to become the first line of defense in what EFF does, and for litigation to be our backstop rather than the other way around? Um, Activism. So I don't think lawsuits can restore the rule of law. I think activism can. And then once the activism restores the rule of law or bolsters the rule of law, then you get space for litigation again. And I wish we were in a different circumstance to now. Like all the best Americans, I'm Canadian. And so I know all these Canadian sayings, like down east, there's this saying, if you wanted to get there, I wouldn't start from here. And definitely, if you wanted to get there, I wouldn't start from here. But this is where we are. And again, to return to the theme of hope, I can see tactics that could materially improve our circumstances. And so long as those tactics remain on the table, there's still hope. Whether it is as hopeful as it was yesterday or darker than it was yesterday is a different matter. But doing nothing is not an option. And so if you can find something meaningful to do, then you know what your next course of action should be.
That's very eloquent. And it seems to like the idea of activism is what you're saying, the way you're describing it is it changes the way people think, and that maybe
Mm-hmm.
that's more powerful than legal mechanisms. It seems like the law is often a go-to for fixing moral or ethical problems, or what does the law say about that? But as you know,
Hmm.
the law it's not necessarily a very strong upholder of ethical action,
Hmm.
but activism itself can make people think about it in a more
Hmm.
think about issues in a more generous way. Hopefully.
Well, I have a friend and mentor who's actually a former EFF board member, a law professor at Harvard called Lawrence Lessig, Larry. And Larry wrote a very important book at the turn of the last century called Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace, where he lays out a framework for how change takes place. And he says change is made by some combination of four forces: code, law, norms, and markets. So, what he means by this is that things that are not technologically possible can't happen. And so, until there's code for it, until the technology exists, the change can't happen. So, the existence, for example, of working encryption, which I think a lot of people underestimate or fail to appreciate just how powerful encryption is, and what how different it is from anything we've ever had in our history as a species or as a civilization. You take this distraction rectangle you carry around in your pocket and you aim it at something and you press the shutter button, and in the eye blink that it takes for that file to be captured to the disk in your phone, it is scrambled so thoroughly that if every hydrogen atom in the universe were a computer and it did nothing until the end of the universe but try to guess what the key was to descramble it, that you would run out of universe a long time before you ran out of possible keys. Right? So this is a new thing in the world. Now it is now possible to have private conversations that cannot be intercepted and decrypted. The only way to decrypt these messages is to either be one of the parties or to compromise one of the devices belonging to one of the parties, to find an error made by the programmer who implemented the encryption, or to coerce one of the parties into decrypting it for you, right? With sometimes called rubber hose cryptanalysis, right? I'm going to tie you to a chair and hit you with a rubber hose until you tell me what your passphrase is. So that's new, right? It's a new thing. And so now that it exists, we can have norms about it, right? Is it ethical to involve someone in a conversation that isn't encrypted? So we're talking today on Zoom. And one of the things Zoom got into trouble for at the start of the pandemic was lying about its encryption. It said that it had end-to-end encryption, and really it just had uh, uh, little bits and pieces that didn't really protect your conversation, especially for group chats. And so normatively, we can say no one should install Zoom because it's not safe. Legally, then, we have space to do things like say the government will not use uh, uh, a system for communicating remotely unless it is secure. And so it won't use Zoom, right? So we could have a procurement guideline. We could have markets intervene. So insurance companies could say, we will not insure your trade secrets unless you are using end to end encryption. We can have all of these things come together as an ensemble. And you can see how when different things change, when normatively being gay became more socially acceptable, it created the legal space for a marriage equality, which is now created, among other things, more normative favor for marriage equality, but also markets, because there's like people who have gay wedding chapels and bake gay wedding cakes and offer gay honeymoons and so on, right? So there's a lot of so when they come for Obergefell, which they will, when the MAGA movement tries to criminalize gay marriage again, um, in addition to being outraged about this, there's just going to be a lot of people who are like, "You're going to make me poor if you do this," and I don't want that to happen. Who may not care quite so deeply about the ethical proposition, but do care about the financial proposition. And so you can see how laws and markets and norms, they work together, how code changes all of them. And I think that it's best to understand this as iterative and as a series of moves that you can make when you feel that something has to change. There's no one tactic that's better than the other. I'm one of the world's terrible parallel parkers. And when I parallel park, I spend a lot of time trying to get a couple inches this way and a couple inches that way and a couple inches. And when you run out of space this way, you got to move in a different direction. And so if you've done everything you can with code, and there's nothing more you can invent to change your situation, maybe you need a law, right? Or maybe you need a campaign, maybe you need a normative campaign, or maybe you need the people who are using the code that you've developed so far and depend on it for their living to start talking about this as a market force, right? So all of these things come together, and there isn't just one that we should use. It's like screwdrivers and hammers and saws and all the other tools in the toolbox. They all have a reason for being there.
Yeah, that's a very nice description. It seems like there's no question, especially when you put it like that, these elements have to come into play. Many different forces have to come into play. And also it's impossible to know why social change happens, but
Sure.
it only happens through all of these different forces. And just getting back to some of the language you had in your book, you talked about this case in Delaware, where it was the Elon Musk case. And you talked about how one of the investors, there was a line that you pulled from one of the investors when they were talking about layoffs. And the investors used the term sharpen your blades, boys.
Yeah, that's Jason Calacanis, who I've known for 25 years and who I think very poorly of. Yeah. So, tech workers used to be the princes of labor, right? There's a National Bureau of Economic Research study that pegged the average contribution of a Silicon Valley tech worker to their employer's bottom line at about $1 million per worker per year. That's why, tech workplaces were whimsical campuses with, free kombucha and a ball pit and massages and dry cleaning and daycare and a surgeon who'll freeze your eggs so you can work through your fertile years. It's not because bosses like tech workers. It's because tech workers were really valuable and because they were in short supply. And bosses hated this because tech workers would mouth off to them and they couldn't fire them. And tech workers who were maltreated or corralled into doing things that violated their moral senses would quit their jobs and find a job somewhere else. And because this was all happening in California, where the state constitution bans non-compete agreements, there was nothing you could do to stop a worker from walking out the door and going to your direct competitor that afternoon. And so you see this kind of insatiable horniness to tame the tech workforce. I think the AI bubble, one of the reasons it's become so potent is because tech bosses just love the idea of firing programmers and replacing them with chatbots. It's just like Hollywood bosses. I live in Burbank, which is where the three of the four major studios are: Disney, Warner, and Universal. And although I'm not in the Writers Guild, I'm in a related guild. I'm in the Animators Guild's writers section because I wrote some animation for Netflix. And so I went out and walked the picket line with my comrades from the Writers Guild during the writers' strikes. One of them said something to me that really stood out, which was that you prompt an LLM, a chatbot, the way that a studio executive gives stupid notes to a group of screenwriters, right? Like, make me eat ET, but make it about a dog, and like put a car chase in Act Two, and make a love interest in there somewhere. And you say that to a writer's room, and the writer's room, just like they call you an idiot. And all work has to stop while they crawl around on the floor looking for the eyeballs that fell out of people's heads when they rolled their eyes so hard. Meanwhile, you say this to a chatbot, it just like barfs out an unusable script. And sure, it's unusable, but at least you don't have to bear the ego depredations of being called an idiot by a bunch of screenwriters who earn 1/10 of 1% of what you do. And then because you've now got the chatbot barfing up scripts, those screenwriters are so desperate that you can tame their mouthiness, and you can say, now your job is to turn the unshootable garbage that came out of the chatbot into something that we can make. And by the way, since there's only 4 movie studios, people are just going to come to the theater to see whatever we put out. It doesn't really matter if it's any good or not. Just like Google, they're too big to care. And under Trump, of course, they're about to merge even more severely into what may be 2 movie studios by the time the Trump term runs out at the rate we're going.
Along with the sharpen your blades, boys, this type of attitude that you just described also, there's the mass layoffs, and you write
Mhm.
about that. So tell me about that, the impact and how you're seeing that in terms of workers' rights.
Yeah, so tech workers, they never really unionized. Tech union density basically can't even be detected with a microscope. And tech workers had the opportunity to do this back when they had all this scarcity driven labor power. But because they conceived of themselves as like temporarily embarrassed founders or entrepreneurs in waiting, and not as workers really, because they saw themselves as peers of their bosses, not employees of their bosses. Some of the bosses went to great lengths to shore up. You know, you have Mark Zuckerberg, Sergey Brin, and other top tech bosses doing weekly or monthly town halls with their whole engineering staff, like it's a stand-up meeting of among equals talking about how the tech should work and not like it's your boss uh, giving you marching orders. They didn't unionize then, and so when tech work supply caught up with demand, you saw mass layoffs. We've seen 500,000 layoffs in the last 3 years in us tech, and you've seen the pressure on workers from code bots. The code bots don't really make software. What they can do is they can write code modules, but being a software engineer is about figuring out how to fit together lots of different pieces of modular code into a coherent whole, which requires a kind of memory, right? You have to know what all the other parts are. And this is one of the things chatbots do not have. Chatbots don't have object persistence. So it's extremely expensive to have chatbots remember their context. This is why the new O5 model, the reasoning model from ChatGPT, and the new reasoning models from Anthropic cost so much more than old models to use, is because they are remembering the things they did before, and the more they remember, they become exponentially expensive. This is why image gen and video gen are so poorly suited to making films or to being used for kind of any long form narrative, because they forget, right? If you This is why if you see video gen, you will have like it'll forget how many fingers the characters have, or it'll forget what background is supposed to be behind them, or it'll forget what their face is supposed to look like, because it pans down and it pans back and it just loses the context window. But you can write code modules of dubious quality with AI, and then kind of indenture real programmers to try and weave those together into a coherent whole to make them effectively neural peripherals for chatbots. And so the weakening of the tech labor force through chatbots, through layoffs, through supply catching up with demand has meant that tech workers no longer really can hold the line on their bosses' enshittificatory impulses. And I mentioned earlier that, Google at one point was turning down $10 billion defense contracts because its workers wouldn't stand for it. And were walking out by the tens of thousands for mass walkouts, mass wildcat strikes, effectively. And today, Google just fires workers. They fired 27,000 workers, or 12,000 workers rather, in 2023, and then just a few months later in 2024, they did a stock buyback, their first of $70 billion, that would have paid those workers wages for 23 years. And these weren't junior coders they laid off. They laid off a lot of their most senior people because they were the most expensive, they were the most entitled, they were the ones who remembered what Google was like when coders had the upper hand. They were the ones who promulgated a culture, a norm of tech workers telling their bosses no. And by getting rid of them, they really broke the back of tech worker solidarity and tech worker um, ethics, right? The idea that tech workers had a responsibility to the future they were building and the users they served to make sure that they weren't harming people.
So that's very chilling, this scenario, but there is always hope in your book. So
Mm-hmm.
there's another part where you write about Para, the
Yeah.
company, and how they allow people who work for DoorDash to find out the tips that
Mm-hmm.
empowers these workers. And then you describe, and like many parts of your writing and your talk and your speeches, it's like then the workers fight back. So
Yeah.
describe DoorDash, and in your book you say DoorDash lost its mind, and you put it in ital. That's very sad
Right.
fine, and how then they hired 40 engineers to combat this. So
Yeah.
even though there's this chilling world that you described, these mass layoffs, there's still ways that you can fight back.
Well, and I think it puts the lie to the idea that it has to be this way, right? That, there's so much interest among workers, among users of technology, in resolving these conflicts in favor of society and not in favor of the investors in these tech platforms and the executives who serve them. And I think that a lot of people will say that we have what right wing economists call the revealed preference. That if you use technologies that invade your privacy, you must not value your privacy very highly. And if you use technologies that rip you off, you must find that it's worth the convenience of it, and so on. And the problem with revealed preferences is that you really only find out what people want if they can make a meaningful choice, right? The idea that people who are starving and sell their kidneys have a revealed preference for having one kidney is clearly not true, right? And what we know about these technologies is that when they appear, right, when you give people the power to defend their privacy, to get a better deal from their employer, and so on, people use them en masse. They use them even when they're not easy to use. There's this idea that unless something is so easy to use that, the phrase everyone uses so terrible is so easy your mom can use it, which is just garbage because like no one designs with moms in mind. So moms have to actually be really ingenious to use technology. I like so easy your boss can use it because if it doesn't work for your boss, people listen to him and they'll like fix it. But the idea that it has to be easy, that it has to be um, legible to people who aren't technical, otherwise no one will use it. It's just not true, right? The people, especially people who are marginalized and precarious, are often very perspicacious early adopters of technology. The first people I ever met who had a phone with a dual SIM cage, so you could have two different carrier SIMs in your phone and use one SIM for texting and the other SIM for calling, and so on. The first people I ever met who did that were daycare workers at my daughter's daycare in East London who were making minimum wage. And it was because in the UK, we had carriers who would give you unlimited texting to your seven best friends, and other carriers who give you unlimited phone calls to your seven best friends. And they didn't have the surplus capital. And so it was worth it to them to pay the opportunity cost to figure this stuff out. I think I am. Oh no, yeah. So I have a few minutes left. I
Yeah, I
just
have one
just
more
have to do a
question.
quick check
Last
in.
question I have
Sure.
for you. There's a line where you say, right, even when the world is chaotic.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. That's.
And
I don't think that's from this book, but I have said that. Yeah.
I would say,
Um,
I really like that. And I would say, right, especially when the world is chaotic.
I think that's right.
And tell me about
Yeah.
how.
I long time ago burned out the part of me that needed things to be just right before I could write. That needed music and candles and a comfortable chair and the kids not to be upset and whatever. I just got to this point where I realized that there were days where I felt like I was writing really well and days where I felt like I was writing really poorly. And when I reviewed the work afterwards, there was work that was great and work that needed another pass or two or wouldn't survive, but that these weren't correlated. That the most predictable correlate of work that I felt good while I was writing was whether I felt good about everything else. Was I well rested? Was I things going well for me in my day job? All of those were big predictors, and the biggest predictor of feeling like things were going badly was like, did I fight with my then girlfriend, now wife? Was I jet lagged? Was I hungover? Had I missed a meal? And that recognition was really liberating because it let me get to a place where even when I felt like I was writing things that were just ghastly and without merit and would just I'd have to delete when I was done, I could just keep writing because I knew that I was writing stuff that may be good and may be bad, but that I wouldn't be able to tell the difference until later on, and that my feelings about my work were not connected to the quality of the work in any meaningful way. It's a very liberating realization. 10 years later, I realized the corollary, which is the days where you feel really good about your work, maybe it's terrible. Luckily, by then I'd already developed the habit of writing, no matter how I felt. But that is a somewhat depressing insight, I think. And it meant that writing could become the way that I resolve or make sense of my own emotional turmoil. That if things were going bad in the world, I could use the page as a way to organize my thoughts about them and create some perspective. And it was very powerful.
I think that's brilliant, and I think that's a good place to stop.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm going to stop my recording here and I'll send you a Google Drive link. If you just let me know um, when you've got it safely on your computer so I can delete it, because I'm doing a lot of interviews right now with the book about to come out, and I'm running out of G Drive. So,
That sounds good. Let me check and see.
well, I'll have it for you in 10 minutes. I'll email you. So just grab it when you get that email.
That sounds good, and I'll let you know that it's arrived safely.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your interest in my work.
Oh, it's so fun talking to you. Thanks. See
It
you.
was great talking to you too.
Okay. Bye bye. See you.
Thank you. Bye.